I bought San Pedro peyote on Amazon.
Are you growing peyote too?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm Yuki, joined by my co-host Reggie, and you're listening to Modern Day Hippie, the podcast about doing drugs in a responsible, fun, and safe way to improve your life. Before we jump into today's episode, a quick legal disclaimer. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Our goal is to educate and inform others about the realities of substance use in an engaging format. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to attempt to recreate anything found in this episode or any of our other content. We are not confessing to any acts stated in this podcast. The content in this episode should not be treated as factual or real in any way. Now, with that, we hope you enjoyed today's show. Modern Day Hippies, welcome back to another episode of your favorite podcast. Hope you're having the vibiest day of all. I am very excited for a special guest that we have on the podcast today. His name is Mushease, and he is an amateur mycologist and a student and practitioner of the psychedelic arts. So, Mushease, I'll let you dive into a little bit. If you want to break down that description for our listeners and tell us how you ended up being such a student of the psychedelic world.
Absolutely. I just want to say first and foremost, thank you, Reggie and Yuki, for having me on this podcast. It's truly an honor. And I guess we'll dive right in. So I define the psychedelic arts as an expression of my mind, body, and soul through psychedelic experiences to improve my own quality of life and as well as the quality of life of the others around me. I've been leading psilocybin journeys for a few months now, not that long, since early summer. It really started with leading psilocybin journeys with my wife. Then I started leading it with a few friends, and it kind of started to take off from there. So I would say my own personal journey with psychedelics, I'd like to start off with the note that I actually had no real interest in doing psychedelics maybe about 5 years ago. It wasn't until the scientific literature was really just too compelling to ignore anyways.
Yeah. And honestly, one thing that surprised me is we've known each other for, I want to say a little over a year now. Is that right?
Yeah.
And I feel like when we first met, we talked a decent amount about psychedelics, but it wasn't something I think that it definitely wasn't as big a part of your life as it is now. And now that we've caught back up, it's been really incredible and special to see how big of a part of your life it has become. And so I'm curious, what led you to taking those steps down that journey?
Yeah. So my first psychedelic experiences were really exploratory. They weren't yet intentional. I was kind of just playing around. I had recognized something valuable within my psychedelic experiences. And I kind of started to lean into it a little bit more and more until I started having exposure to the psychedelic literature, the Johns Hopkins studies and whatnot. There's some really, really great ones, really broke a lot of ground. And then I just couldn't ignore it anymore. My experiences started getting deeper and deeper. We dove into heroic doses, and I had some incredibly spiritual experiences that are kind of puzzling and tough to describe. And then when I started doing more journeys with my wife, I started seeing some incredible things. I don't want to be arrogant in saying that we are finding a way to cure depression, but we're finding a way to manage it. And beyond that, what I found really puzzling about that experience was my wife wasn't really using it intentionally. She wasn't doing integration and intention that deeply, but I found that she was able to articulate herself much better. And this was with, a handful of trips. Maybe after 4 trips, her ability to command the English language went up multiple grades. And that was shocking. And I was really opened my eyes to the power of psilocybin and psychics.
Do you mean in a poetic kind of way, or?
It really was. We can talk a little bit about, so when I lead a journey, let's start with that. And then we can talk about what my wife's visions look like on her psychedelic journeys. So when I lead a journey, every journey starts with intention. This is best done when there is a physical pilgrimage where one can meditate on purpose. So for a lot of people who visit me to do a psilocybin journey, they'll take the bus out or take an Uber up. And it's that physical pilgrimage that is the beginning of something transformational. So when you get to meditate on purpose, these are the broad strokes of manifestation. When you can have intention and faith kind of commingle, we begin to achieve what is clinically described as confidence. So we take this confidence into ingestion, onset, come up, and so forth. And we use music and conversation therapy with breathwork and meditation to get a lot of things done to really help with that intention and start to begin to manifest that and bring that into the real life.
Yeah, and when we did the trip that you guided me through, it was funny because I had my intention that I think I had like written in the survey you sent out about a week prior. And then throughout the journey of my trip, you kind of reminded me of my intention, especially when I might have been getting distracted with like, I don't know, just other like interesting thoughts or visuals or things like that, but always kind of like coming back to that point. And it's almost like every time you reminded me of it, I was able to view like that part of my life and that intention from a different perspective. So it's like I was at a different point in my trip and I was coming from maybe a place of being like very observing of like my breath versus really into some like wild closed eye visuals. I really appreciated having your like reminders to come back to that, because I think especially on mushrooms, it can be easy to kind of let yourself wander. That might lead to some interesting productive places, or it might just be kind of like fun, but not very purpose driven. And I have noticed that intentionality is a very big part of how you approach psychedelics.
Yeah, I really try to. That's not to say that all of my psychedelic journeys have been like this. Some of it did look like abuse in the more exploratory ways, but it always felt wrong to me after having an experience like that where I kind of misused it. It felt like a waste of resources. But what I kind of want to dive into now is the tools that we use during the session and kind of how these things can help. And then once again, so some of the tools that I use on the psychedelic journey can bring real value to your own journey. We use a blindfold, and we use this during musical therapy. And what that allows us to do is really dive inward. So much of our time and our mental capacity during a trip is spent on processing the incredible visual things that are happening around us. So when we go close-eyed or use a blindfold, we tend to dive much deeper into introspection. So in addition to the blindfold, we also use classical music. Really, instrumental music is the most important part of it. If you can make it personally significant, that is even better. So if you have a connection with jazz or blues or video game music, you can find a plethora of different classical notations of classical is really what they're using in the clinical studies. So I tend to lean towards classical. However, I have been experimenting with some traditional Chinese music that has been equally beneficial. And then the last major tool that we have in our toolbox is the weed pen. This one we didn't really use, me and Yuki. I used it a little bit, but I prefer to use a 2-to-1 CBD blend so that you get to keep your mental clarity. But what this really allows you to do is undershoot the dosage for your psilocybin and your mushrooms. And then it allows you to compensate for that dosage and dial into a very specific place. So I really love the weed pen in terms of from a safety standpoint, because sometimes dosing with psilocybin becomes really difficult. The lowest potency to the highest potency stuff might vary with psilocybin mushrooms.
Yeah, and just having that device to level yourself up on the spot and then down relatively quickly. Like even as someone who's not just a big like weed smoker in general, I do see the value in that. And yeah, I do wish that nice. We were doing our guided trip in person instead of over FaceTime. Yeah. So I could have also partaken. Yeah. Coming from a totally like non-weed smoker at all.
Yeah.
It would have been many cool more to add that to the experience. Yeah. No, and it seems like a lot of your approach to psilocybin and to these kind of like mini retreats essentially is driven by like the clinical studies and the processes that they're doing things. I'm curious, out of maybe the key, let's say like milestones or points of those clinical experiences, are there any that maybe you don't resonate with as much or that you think are maybe being done in a way that you have like actively decided not to integrate into your practices?
Yeah, I would say that I've taken what is personally relevant, what resonates with me, and dropped certain practices that don't necessarily feel authentic. There are untold numbers of integration practices. A lot of them are culturally specific. So as I might take the clinical things and integrate them, I'm sometimes more hesitant to take the cultural things to integrate them if they're not authentic to me.
What are some examples of these?
There are Mexican practices. Psilocybin is definitely a long-standing thing that they've used within their cultures. Their specific integration practices are culturally based and they'll vary regional to regional places.
What's good, MDH fans? It's your boy Yuki here. I've got a scenario for you. It's the holidays, you're partying, the music is thumping, but you're fading. So what now? Do you call it a night? No way. Then you realize I can sniff some cacao. Hold on, sniff what? You heard right, sniff some cacao. It's the hottest new trend in the club and party scene. One bum-sized sniff of raw chocolatey powder hits instantly and you are back in action. You ask how? Snow-Go Straw's luxury spring-loaded bum straws make it possible. Just push the plunger at the top and dip the scoop into your beautiful vial of our velvety chocolate powder. No measuring, no cleanup, no mess. It's the safest, most discreet way to enjoy sniffing cacao. You've likely seen people wearing Snow-Go's bum straws as pendants around their necks. With Snow-Go straws, you can now sniff cacao anytime, anywhere, on the dance floor, at the bar, really anywhere. Discover Snow-Go straws, and because you heard it here, you can get a whopping 25% off your entire order. Stock up for the holidays and jump on over to snowgostraws.com. That's SNOGOSTRAWS.com. Order today and use promo code MDH25 and get 25% off your entire order. The promo code ends on New Year's Eve, and we are sharing the big love. Remember to use MDH25 and happy holidays. What I found particularly interesting about the way that you kind of pitch and run these experiences is that it does feel genuinely authentic to you, like who you are, where you come from, what you believe in. And I think even, talking about like from the talismans to the like archetypical superheroes, which I'll touch on in a future episode, right? Dive deep on my experience. I love how you bring those elements in, and like it is very clearly like a Mushease experience.
So right now I'm on a journey to dive into the underground world of psilocybin clinics in my city. As far as legality goes, our government is beginning to look the other way for psychedelics. There are retail shops and online deliveries that you can do. I could probably have a 3-hour delivery of psychedelics if I made a call right now. Yeah, that's full service.
Wow, that's full service, baby.
So things are moving really quickly where I am. It is likely that within 5 years, we will see some sort of legalization. Our police forces have even gone on to say that they are reconsidering enforcing any shutdowns. Something about the progress of this feels inevitable.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I feel like anything that is drug related will just kind of build up a slow and steady following, let's say like underground, under the radar. It will accelerate, and sooner or later, like there must be some inflection point from a higher level. Like that's what we're seeing with marijuana in the US. In this case, a few inflection points, at state level, like medicinal and then recreational, some kind of in between, like some decriminalized place. Yeah, and like I know like Reggie and I have been really excited to see, I think, 2 states like Colorado and Washington, if I'm not mistaken, totally decriminalize any like naturally occurring substances, which counts not only weed, but also psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, DMT, essentially anything that's not synthetic.
Absolutely. I'm very much a fan of decriminalized
that's
nature
really exciting.
plant medicines. Something about banning natural elements like that doesn't jive well with me.
Yeah, we're definitely in the second psychedelic renaissance right now.
Yeah, I hope we don't get this one wrong this time.
Yeah, no, dude, speaking of that, I don't know if you guys saw, but I think it was earlier this week, there was that article about the like pilot who was basically flying like shotgun on like an Alaska Airlines flight. And he literally like tried to wrestle control away from the pilot who's actually like driving the plane and try to make it crash. And like that is like he got charged with like 80 felony counts. Like, US post 9/11, like you just don't fuck with airplanes, like period. And then it freaking came out in all these headlines that he was like, oh yeah, it was my first time tripping on psychedelic mushrooms. And I'm in a bunch of like group chats of people who are into psychedelics and stuff. And man, like this is not the representation that we want for this. Like that is just so like idiotic. That's like drinking alcohol for your first time. Like, I don't know, co-piloting an airplane.
So was it confirmed that he had ingested before the flight? And that's something that I hadn't looked into.
Yeah, so I haven't dug into it too much, but the headlines were all like, it was basically a follow-up to the earlier story, which I think a lot of people picked up on. And so the follow-up was like, oh, it turns out this pilot
or the passenger
was tripping on psychedelic mushrooms for his first time. I did read in, sorry, it wasn't the pilot. He's a guy who like his job is being a pilot, but basically what pilots will do is if they need to get to another city and they're not actively like driving the plane for the commercial airline, they'll basically sit like shotgun or in, I think it's called the jump seat, like in the cockpit of the plane. So it's like sitting passenger.
I could take anything while doing that. Like
driving. I mean, yeah, like technically he wasn't responsible for anything, but it's like if you get fucked up enough on something, like there are chances that you're going to do some stupid shit. But what I read on like one or two Reddit threads about this was that people were saying that apparently he took the mushrooms like 48 hours before. Like it wasn't even a recent thing. And I can't confirm or deny like what is actually true there. But if that's the case, then it's very much just like a scapegoat response for him to probably get out of like literally multiple lifetimes.
I wonder if he had a history of psychoses. Like something about that whole story doesn't really add up because I was under the impression that he hadn't ingested before the flight. It was he had come down from a trip already.
Okay, yeah, and then I mean that lines up with the comments that I had read that it was like 48 hours or so before the flight even, which at that point, I think no matter how much shrooms you take,
but
like
this is exactly why it's so important
you're sober.
Lead with the clinical evidence. Most of the things that I try and do are led by this clinical guidance. I think it's really important to broaden our knowledge base of best practices when using psychedelics because I think a lot of the common verbiage is not as productive as it could be. You know, we talk about set and setting and things like this, but I think we can add a little bit of complexity to this discussion.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of that, I know that you've guided quite a few people's like first time ever trips. Would love to hear how you kind of warmed them up to the idea and how they decided it was something that they wanted to try after, going their whole lives, maybe not knowing about it or being hesitant about it. Because I know that's something that, I encounter with like friends and family. Maybe they're curious, but for whatever reason, they have this mental block where they don't want to do it. And that's never a situation you should force, like under any circumstance.
So with one of my really close friends, he basically did the trip just to kind of quiet me down. And I guess I was annoying him enough about this stuff that it was both a decision from him. Obviously, I had exposed him to the benefits of this type of stuff. And then finally, just to kind of shut me up about it. And he had some really interesting insights because he was someone who I would say absolutely had no interest in using any psychedelics. However, he was using SSRIs. So I was just basically telling him about my own experience with my wife. And he got to have a lot of conversations with my wife before he finally turned about this. And he was saying how it was much less intrusive than he thought it was going to be. I think a lot of people who have no real concept of what psychedelics are think of it as hysteria. And it's tough not to think of it as hysteria when that message has been pushed so thoroughly.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the ways that just tripping is depicted in media so much, like, and the stories you hear, obviously you only hear the worst of the worst, such as the airline thing. And yeah, I think it paints this false picture of the psychedelic world where it's like, to an extent, you are losing some control, but it's not even so much control. It's more like your sense of self. Like in my experiences, and this is purely anecdotal, but even when I've taken like ridiculous ego death amounts of psilocybin or LSD, like I've never done something like super just crazy or out of whack. And I know that definitely can happen, but I'm very curious, like how much that reflects on just a person's mindset or pre-existing conditions. And that to me is also one of the hardest things when I'm like explaining it to people and trying to make them curious about psychedelics is like, you just may not know if you have one of these pre-existing conditions that will make you have like a terrible time. And so I know that a lot of clinics and studies will like screen for that as best they can, but especially as a recreational user, like what do you look for? Like, I don't know, like when you're looking at potentially guiding people through trips, are you trying to get a sense of like family histories of this kind of stuff, or how do you like protect yourself?
I've been leading journeys with friends, so I know them personally. So if I kind of deem that you might be an emotional liability, then it's not really something that I will do. But if you were to, you would aim on the lower side on psilocybin so that you could dial in correctly, because you don't want to offer them a hero dose because they likely won't have the mental fortitude to be able to go through that experience, even with guidance. It might be incredibly difficult for them. And we always want to err on the side of safety. So we will play it safe in that sense.
Dude, like amen to that. It really bothers me when people are under the assumption that their first time tripping, they're like, oh, I need to really experience this fully. Like, nah, like ease into it, dip your toes. Like,
dude, you're just shooting your tolerance at that point. So one of the things that bothers me, it's like you just wrecked your tolerance your first time tripping and you're never going to be able to trip like that again.
That's interesting. Never really thought about it like that.
I mean, like you could trip like that with a high enough dose, but it's not the same, you know?
So I usually, for a first trip, gauge their personality and I'll ask too, their tolerance for adventure is how I might phrase it.
Is that a question that you get answers like 1 to 10 through, or like, I'm just curious how people have responded to that.
I usually don't do it as scale. You can kind of just read by their tone and how they answer the question, what their tolerance is. But it is you do have to be mindful of that.
Yeah.
A lot of the first journeys that I've led to are people who have heard of the wonders of psychedelics. They're sometimes creative people, or they're the type who would have tried them regardless.
Yeah, I see. And it's like anything before that point, like you just need to let people get to that point if they want to on their own. Like even in talking to specific members of my family who've been curious about it, and I never thought in their lives would consider any sort of like recreational psychedelic substance like this. You know, you have a couple of small conversations spread out over the course of like months or maybe even years. You kind of like plant those seeds and they get curious. And then now they're asking me like, how can they safely have their first experience with, you know, a trained quote unquote like professional guide. And that's been another difficulty I've run into, where it's like, I don't feel comfortable guiding most people through like their first experiences, but also I don't know like who else to trust or where else to send them to ensure that they have, you know, as positive an experience as possible. Like it truly, obviously it's a very underground world, especially in the US. It's purely word of mouth. And beyond that, like there's just not a whole lot to go off of.
Yeah, it's a dangerous place. Definitely. Even given what, you know, even given what regulation looks like in my locale, and we have to be incredibly careful.
Speaking of that, like I'm curious, you know, as you say, you're going on this journey to get a little bit more like enmeshed in the scene in your city with clinics, guides, things like that around psychedelics. Like, how are you actually like meeting those people, like finding those spaces, whether physical or just, you know, gatherings and meetings like that?
Yeah, it was kind of difficult to find my community, and it seemed like actually I lucked into it because I started doing these breathwork courses. I don't know if you guys have heard of holotropic breathwork. You guys might have seen them depicted in movies. They're those giant group breathing circles where everyone's like doing essentially seated cardio. You're cycling through different types of yogic breaths, fire breaths, and we essentially sit in a group and we breathe heavily until it feels like drugs. And I found these places to be incredibly safe spaces in which I was able to have some really open conversations, which led to these people telling me about their own experiences with other guides. And I should have realized that it was a thing, but it had not really dawned on me yet that there would be an underground community of practitioners.
Right. Yeah. No, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I would say for the last like year or two, whenever I'm meeting someone new, in most contexts, I'll find just kind of a subtle way to slip in like something related to psychedelics. You're just like, hey, like, I think, you know, like drugs can be cool and positive in the right way. Is just like very low key and just seeing how they react. And honestly, I've gotten way fewer negative reactions than I expected. And granted, obviously, it's just, you know, like sample bias of I tend to meet people in places that probably attract other people who are fairly like-minded to me. But the reactions I'd say are pretty split 50-50 between like, hell yeah, same page, we can have an interesting conversation about psychedelics and drugs, or it's like a cautious curiosity and they're in that archetype of like, they want to try it safely for the first time and they just don't know how. But very few just like straight up like, nah, like not my thing.
That one might be, I feel like that one might be, you're putting the energy towards the world, a certain type of energy, and you're kind of getting that back with the specific community. But I think that is
right.
That trend is probably reflected in the greater population as well.
Yeah, it's 100% building, which is incredible to see. I also wanted to touch on the aspect of you being an amateur mycologist as well. Curious to hear a little bit about like how you think about growing like different strains of mushrooms. And I know you introduced me to this like annual
Yeah,
competition of like
definitely.
who can grow most potent mushrooms. Like tell
So
us a little bit about
that
that.
competition is a really interesting one. I think the organization that runs it is called Oakland Hippie or Hippie Labs, and they run an annual psilocybin cup. So it's getting bigger and bigger every year. There's this last report that they put out was really interesting because you no longer had some of the common entrants into the competition. Like we're all familiar with penis envy strains and cubensis strains, but you really started to see some obscure ones this year that sent, the scales off the scales. But in terms of my own amateur mycology, it really started out with a kit about 6 months ago. It was golden teachers. That is generally suggested for a first time grower because they are a little bit more tolerant and resistant to things. So I harvested from this kit about 60 to 70 dried ounces. I also took a bunch of them to make a little bit of honey, mushroom honey. So it's just you toss the raw mushrooms inside a batch of honey and it starts to preserve them and ferment them naturally.
Wow. Have you found that the psilocybin distributes evenly throughout the honey, or is it like sometimes you eat some honey and it like doesn't really hit you, and other times it's like a fucking trip?
I haven't tested the honey yet. I'm going to let it stew
Okay.
for a little
Okay.
while, but I don't know how much of the honey, or sorry, how much of the psilocybin and psilocin actually gets extracted into the
Right.
honey. Whether like I think it's mainly just a preservation method.
I see.
And then also, I just recently harvested my first batch of albino penis envies. They're the most adorable little mushies. It wasn't a big batch. I was testing a couple of new different types of setups, and I still have a lot of
Hey,
honing to
it's an
do.
iterative process, and I like how like you knew the right species to start with. You know, the one that was just easier not to fuck up, because I know for me, even just trying to take care of my partner's houseplants fail miserably sometimes. So it's good that there's like a skill tree to like start with golden teachers and then move up to it. And then I imagine at some point you can start like cross pollinating, like crossbreeding different strains. Or like how did these new strains that came up at this like Hyphy Labs annual thing? Like do you
So
know where those came from?
I was referring to more rarer strains. So these are strains beyond cubensis. However, it is possible to kind of create your own
Mm,
strains. The details of that are a little bit beyond my current comfort level, but you can find spores on many online retailers to be able to do this. The spores generally keep for very long, and I believe you are allowed to send spores over mail through most carriers.
yeah, I mean, I've heard that you can literally just buy them on Amazon, and that it's like, yeah, like perfectly legal, accessible in most places that I've heard of.
I bought San Pedro peyote on Amazon.
Are you growing peyote too?
Yeah, definitely. I think I just got seeds in the mail as well. That one's a long game,
Okay.
though. That one might take a couple of years in order to come to fruition.
Dude, I mean, you very well might end up being one of the only people in your city growing peyote in their fucking backyard.
Yeah, we'll see about that. Yeah,
That's epic. Well, if it happens, I'll have to come try some.
absolutely. Reggie, please, I'd love for you to come visit me as well if you have the time.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, and actually, you guys will meet in December, also off podcast recording. Yeah, yeah, but it'll be good. Reggie, were there any topics or questions you want to ask before I ask my final prompt?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, whenever you're guiding someone through one of these psychedelic trips, are you always tripping with them, or do you ever just do it sober, like just in case you feel like something might go wrong or something like that?
So currently, I do also ingest with them. As I begin my learning journey on how to lead, it is kind of a tool that I'm using to kind of ingrain these lessons a little bit more deeply. Eventually, I will taper off. I expect to be leading enough journeys that I don't think I should ingest with everybody that I have a journey with. That might get a little bit excessive,
Yeah.
but it's interesting because obviously in the clinical trials, the practitioners do not ingest with them, but in the more indigenous practices, the practitioners usually ingest with the patients.
Have you seen any discrepancies between clinical settings and indigenous settings in terms of like whether it's solo or more group based? Because I always picture clinical trials being like one patient, and then I think I don't know if this applies to psilocybin, but having like at least two like therapists in the room
I think that's
versus,
norm.
versus like I hear plenty of retreats in like Costa Rica, Jamaica, etc., where it does tend to be more like a group.
Tell you the truth, I haven't had much time to ponder this specific thing, but I think with psilocybin in general, the ones in Jamaica are group led. It's probably just more economical that way. It would be, as you can imagine, it's quite expensive to have two practitioners in a room. The FDA, I think, also requires 6 hours of time after the come down before they're allowed to leave.
Oh, wow. That's like a full day.
Yeah.
Just commitment.
Absolutely.
Easily.
Maybe it's not 6 hours, but it is a long period of time. It's still, I think it's a little unreasonable, but
yeah. Agreed with that. Cool. And then last question that I want to ask you is, I feel like you're still like just at the beginning, like just in the first steps of your journey here. Like, where do you see yourself on your psychedelics journey? I don't know, like 2 or 3 years down the line. What are you excited about? What role do you envision yourself like playing within this world that I think is very quickly coming to meet us and growing with us?
Yeah. So these next couple of years, I want to see as many practitioners as I possibly can. This includes people within psilocybin clinics as well as breathwork practitioners. I think that's a great resource to kind of pull scripts in and powerful frameworks to weave into what I do. So I will continue to do a lot of breathwork stuff and steal from the best, and hopefully get myself to a place where when legalization is around the corner and our governments announce what type of certifications that we need, I'll kind of, 1 foot ready to make that move. I hope to turn my home into a type of clinic where I have, tools for all different modalities. Currently I have a massage table. I have all sorts of massage guns and machines. I have a cold plunge. We're going to have an outdoor and indoor sauna, probably multiple ones, and multiple different strategies that we can use that we can layer on top of each other with psilocybin therapies. And I hope this place to be a retreat where our community can kind of enjoy all these things that we are gleaning from the clinical researching.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds badass. I can't wait to come check it out and experience all these different, I want to say like all these like toys that you've set up around this, but they're not just toys. They're like very valuable and helpful tools. So, but tools can be toys. Tools can be fun as well. Yeah. Is there anywhere that listeners can keep up with you or follow you if they want to follow along on your journey?
Yeah, sure. I just set up a link tree. So linktr.ee/Mushease, which is MUSHEASE.
Yeah, and we'll throw that down in the description as well, so everyone can check it out.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you all for listening, and that's the pod. Truly, thank you for listening to the show. We seriously fucking appreciate it. If you want to help us out, just leaving a rating or a comment, the drill, would be incredibly helpful. But more importantly, share the knowledge and the love with your friends. Make sure they're getting the information they need on this topic that is so underserved and underappreciated in today's society. We'll see y'all next week.